In my 50s, I never expected to feel such emotions. Life had settled into a quiet rhythm, one that seemed unshakable in its predictability. My mornings began with a cup of coffee brewed just the way I liked it, followed by a solitary walk around my neighborhood. Afternoons were spent tidying up my modest home or diving into a novel, losing myself in the lives of characters far more adventurous than my own. Evenings, though, were the loneliest. The empty dinner table and the soft hum of the television were my only companions. My daughter, Emily, was grown and married, living her own bustling life. And me? I'd accepted that my time for grand passions and sweeping romances had passed. Or so I thought. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary day by all accounts. I was at Greenleaf Market, my go-to grocery store, clutching my shopping list with the same determination I'd once reserved for life's bigger pursuits. I stood in the produce section, debating the merits of Gala versus Honeycrisp apples, when I heard a voice behind me. "Go with the Honeycrisp. They're sweeter this time of year." I turned, startled, and there he was, tall, with warm brown eyes and a grin that could melt the frostiest heart. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, far too young to be making my pulse quicken the way it did. "Oh," I said, fumbling for words. "Thanks for the tip." He reached over and picked up a Honeycrisp, examining it with a playful seriousness. "Trust me, you won't regret it. I'm Adam, by the way." "Claire," I replied, trying to steady my voice. Our conversation was brief, just long enough for me to learn that he worked as a freelance photographer and had a penchant for culinary experiments. He joked about trying to perfect an apple tart recipe, and before I knew it, I was offering him tips on making the crust flakier. When he walked away, I felt a pang of disappointment, something I hadn't felt in years. It was ridiculous, really. I barely knew him, and yet his warmth and ease lingered like a melody I couldn't forget. As I finished my shopping and drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, I caught myself smiling for no particular reason. I'd met a charming man at a grocery store. Nothing more, nothing less. But in the quiet solitude of my life, even that brief encounter felt like a spark. What I didn't realize then was that Adam was about to become much more than a fleeting moment in the produce aisle. After that brief encounter at the grocery store, I didn't expect to see Adam again. Yet a week later, there he was, standing in the same produce section, holding a bundle of kale. My heart did an involuntary flip. What were the odds? Or perhaps was it fate? "You again," he said, his grin widening as he caught sight of me. "Don't tell me you're here for another apple debate." I laughed, feeling a warmth rise in my cheeks. "No debates today. Just stocking up on the essentials." We fell into an easy conversation, discussing everything from his latest photography project to the merits of seasonal fruits. He had this way of speaking that made me feel entirely at ease, as though the years separating us didn't exist. Before I knew it, I was confessing my struggle with finding good recipes for one, which led him to invite me to a cooking class he frequented at a local community center. "You should come," he said, his tone so casual it felt as though he were inviting an old friend. "They're always looking for more people, and I swear you'd love it." I hesitated. It had been years since I'd tried anything new, let alone something that would force me to interact with strangers. But his enthusiasm was infectious. "Maybe," I replied, unsure if I'd actually follow through. The next day, though, I found myself standing outside the community center, clutching my bag nervously. Stepping inside felt like stepping out of my comfort zone. But as soon as I saw Adam waving at me from across the room, my anxiety melted away. The class was a whirlwind of laughter and activity. We worked side by side, chopping vegetables and debating the proper way to caramelize onions. At one point, he nudged me playfully with his elbow. "See, told you this would be fun." And it was. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy, as though I'd rediscovered a part of myself I hadn't realized was missing. From that day on, Adam and I began seeing each other more regularly. He'd call to share a new recipe he wanted to try, or text me photos of his latest culinary experiments. I found myself looking forward to our chats, our impromptu cooking sessions, and the way he made me laugh so effortlessly. It wasn't just the activities or the conversation, it was the way he made me feel. Like I was more than just a woman in her 50s, more than someone living a quiet, predictable life. He brought a sense of lightness and joy into my days, and I found myself craving it more and more. But even as our connection deepened, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubts. What are you doing, Claire? He's younger. He probably sees you as nothing more than a friend. I brushed the thoughts aside, content for the moment to simply enjoy his company. Little did I know, this growing friendship was laying the foundation for something far more profound. It was during one of our cooking sessions that everything changed. Adam had invited me to his place to try a recipe he'd been perfecting. Some sort of fusion pasta dish he swore was game-changing. I arrived with a bottle of wine and a nervous flutter in my stomach I couldn't quite explain. His apartment was modest but brimming with personality. The walls were adorned with his photography, breathtaking shots of cityscapes, nature, and candid moments. It was like stepping into a gallery of his life. "Make yourself at home," he said as he handed me an apron. His easy smile melted away any lingering awkwardness. We worked together in his small kitchen, navigating the cramped space with laughter and ease. At one point, as I was stirring the sauce, he stood close behind me, reaching around to adjust the heat on the stove. The brush of his arm against mine was fleeting, but it sent a shiver up my spine. I froze for a moment, caught off guard by my own reaction. Later, as we sat down to eat, I found myself watching him more closely. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about his passions, the way he laughed so freely. He was vibrant, alive, and utterly captivating. "Claire," he said, breaking into my thoughts. "You okay? You've been awfully quiet." "Oh, just tired," I lied, forcing a smile. The truth was, I was overwhelmed by a realization I hadn't seen coming. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the evening in my mind, it hit me. I had feelings for him. Not just fondness or admiration, but real, undeniable feelings. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. How had this happened? He was so much younger, and yet I couldn't stop thinking about the way he made me feel. The way he brought color and light back into my life after years of monotony. But with that realization came a wave of fear. Was I being foolish? What would people say if they knew? And most importantly, how could I possibly expect him to feel the same? I tossed and turned for hours, torn between the thrill of this newfound emotion and the weight of my insecurities. Falling for Adam felt like stepping into the unknown, and I wasn't sure I was ready for the journey ahead. Still, one thing was clear. My feelings for him were real, and no amount of self-doubt could make them go away. Whether I liked it or not, my heart had awakened, and there was no turning back. Did I end the days that followed? My emotions became an unruly storm I couldn't control. Every time I saw Adam's name flash on my phone or heard his voice, a mix of excitement and anxiety surged through me. I had spent years building a life that was steady, predictable, safe. And now, with one spark, he'd set fire to all of it. I found myself overanalyzing every moment we'd shared. Was his kindness just friendliness? Did he see me as a mentor, a companion, or something more? My heart yearned for answers, but my mind filled with doubts. One evening, as I sipped tea in my quiet kitchen, Emily called. Hearing her voice was a comfort, but it also reminded me of the vast chasm between my age and Adam's. My daughter was 27, only a year younger than him. What would she think if she knew? The thought made my stomach churn. "Mom, you sound distracted," Emily said. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," I replied, the same excuse I'd been using with Adam. But I wasn't tired. I was consumed by longing, by fear, and by the realization that this was no passing crush. I cared for Adam deeply, more than I dared to admit to myself. The fear of judgment loomed large. I could already imagine the whispers, the raised eyebrows, the accusations of desperation. Society didn't look kindly on women like me falling for men like Adam. It wasn't just an age gap. It was a challenge to everything people thought they knew about love, propriety, and the roles we were supposed to play. Yet, beneath the fear, there was a quiet, rebellious part of me that wanted to say to hell with all of it. Why should I deny myself the happiness Adam brought into my life? Why should I let age dictate who I was allowed to love? That inner battle raged on, leaving me restless and unsure of my next move. Part of me wanted to pull back, to protect myself from the possibility of rejection or humiliation. But another part wanted to leap forward, to take the risk and embrace the chance at something extraordinary. I remembered a moment from the cooking class, when Adam had reached out to wipe a bit of flour off my cheek. It was such a simple gesture, but it had felt so intimate, so natural. The memory made my heart ache in a way that felt both beautiful and unbearable. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that this wasn't just about Adam. It was about me, about daring to believe that love could still find me, even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I couldn't keep running from my feelings. It was time to face them, no matter where they might lead. I knew I had to make a choice. Sitting with my feelings, hoping they'd dissolve or fade, wasn't going to work. If anything, the more time I spent with Adam, the stronger they became. It was time to take a step forward, to see if this connection I felt was real or if it only existed in my heart. It took me a full day to gather the courage. Even as I typed out the message to him, my hands shook. "Hey Adam, I just finished baking a blueberry pie, but it's far too much for one person. If you're free tonight, I'd love to share it with you." No pressure, of course. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity before hitting send. What if he said no? What if he said yes? Either possibility made my stomach churn. His reply came within minutes. "Pie is my weakness. What time should I come over?" I smiled despite myself, a flutter of nerves and anticipation filling my chest. I told him 6:30, then spent the next 2 hours pacing around the house, second-guessing everything. Should I light candles? Would that seem too romantic? Should I change into something less casual? Or more casual? By the time the doorbell rang, I was a bundle of nerves. I took a deep breath, smoothing my blouse before opening the door. "Wow, something smells amazing," Adam said, stepping inside with his usual easy charm. He carried a bottle of wine which he handed to me with a grin. "Thought this might go well with dessert." "Perfect," I replied, leading him to the kitchen. The evening began casually enough. We chatted while I served up slices of pie, the conversation flowing as effortlessly as it always did. But beneath the surface, there was a different kind of tension, an awareness that hadn't been there before. At one point, as we sat at the small dining table, I noticed the way Adam looked at me, not just with kindness or amusement, but with something deeper, something that made my breath catch. "This is incredible," he said, gesturing to his empty plate. "You've officially ruined all other pies for me." I laughed, feeling a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the wine. "I'm glad you liked it." As the evening wore on, the conversation shifted. He told me about a challenging project he was working on, and I found myself opening up about things I hadn't shared with anyone in years, my fears, my regrets, the loneliness that had settled into my life like an unwelcome guest. "You know," Adam said softly, his gaze steady on mine, "you're a lot stronger than you give yourself credit for." His words hit me like a wave, breaking through the walls I'd built around myself. For a moment, I couldn't speak, the vulnerability of the moment leaving me raw and exposed. "Thank you," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was heavy with unspoken truths, with possibilities I was almost too afraid to hope for. As the evening came to an end and I walked him to the door, I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and dread. Inviting him over had been a risk, but it had also been a step toward something I wasn't ready to name yet. "Thanks for tonight, Claire," Adam said, his smile as warm as ever. "I'll see you soon." "Yes," I replied, the word carrying more weight than he could possibly know. As I closed the door behind him, I leaned against it, my heart racing. I didn't know what came next, but one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and second-guessing. I replayed our evening together over and over in my mind, wondering if I had said the right things, if the atmosphere had been just the right mix of casual and intimate. Did he sense what I was feeling? Did he feel the same spark that had ignited inside me? The next time Adam came over, I wasn't sure what to expect. We'd agreed to meet for lunch at a small cafe, and there was a nervous energy between us, as if we were both walking on a tightrope, unsure of which direction it might tip. As he arrived, I felt a wave of relief when he flashed that familiar grin, the one that made the edges of my heart soften. He seemed at ease, his eyes meeting mine with that same warmth that had first drawn me to him. "Ready for some comfort food?" he asked, holding up a menu as if we were back in that cozy little restaurant where we had shared our first meal together. I laughed, the tension in my shoulders easing. Absolutely. I've been craving something familiar. As we settled into our booth, the conversation flowed as naturally as it had before. We talked about everything and nothing at all. His plans for a trip he was taking, the new book he'd been reading, and even the oddities of the neighborhood. But I couldn't ignore the way our interactions were subtly shifting. This wasn't just two people sharing a meal anymore. There was something more, something deeper in the way he looked at me, the way his hand brushed against mine as he reached for the salt. It was as if we were both testing the waters, seeing if we could take the next step. After lunch, we decided to take a walk in the park, the sun casting a warm golden glow over the trees. It felt like the perfect kind of day, peaceful, but filled with an underlying current of excitement. We strolled slowly, side by side, occasionally exchanging quiet words, but mostly letting the silence hang between us, comfortable and unhurried. At one point, Adam stopped walking, and I followed his gaze to the small pond where children were playing nearby. It was a simple scene, but there was something beautiful about the way it caught his attention. "I used to come here when I was a kid," he said, his voice soft. "Just sit by the water and think about everything and nothing." I nodded, touched by the way he shared such a quiet, personal memory with me. We had our differences, so many of them, but in this moment, it felt like we were in sync, as if we shared a connection that transcended age, time, and circumstance. Without thinking, I reached out, gently placing my hand on his arm. The contact was small, but it sent a rush of warmth through my body, and I could see him freeze for a moment, as if processing the weight of the touch. I pulled my hand back, suddenly aware of how much I wanted to reach for him, to close the gap between us. But I hesitated, unsure if he would welcome it or pull away. For a long moment he didn't say anything, and I feared I had overstepped. But then he looked at me, and the look in his eyes was one I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the same warmth, it was something deeper, something far more intimate. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but filled with an emotion I could feel in my bones. "Claire," he said softly, I've been thinking about this. About us." His words hung in the air between us, charged with possibility. I felt my heart race, unsure of what to say or do next. But in that moment I didn't need to respond. The silence that followed felt like an invitation, an opening to something new, something neither of us could name yet but both felt undeniably. The connection was real, and it wasn't just a passing moment. It was something we were both leaning into, something that had the potential to change everything. The next few days were a blur of emotions. I had never imagined myself in this position. To be caught up in something so unexpected, so raw, especially at my age, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I spent a lot of time reflecting on our conversation in the park. Adam's words echoed in my mind, and I realized just how much I had been suppressing. The doubts, the fears, the worries that had held me back from fully embracing this strange, beautiful thing we were starting. As a woman in my 50s, I had grown accustomed to the idea of love as something that had passed me by. I had lived a life filled with meaningful relationships, but none had ever felt like this. None had ever made me feel so alive, so seen. But as much as I wanted to believe in it, I couldn't ignore the fears that crept in. Could this really work? Could I, someone twice his age, truly be the right match for Adam? At night, I would lie awake in bed, my thoughts racing. I thought about the judgment from others, the disapproval that would undoubtedly follow if people knew. What would my friends think? What would my daughter say if she found out? But beyond the fear, there was a deeper truth I couldn't deny. What Adam and I shared was real, and I couldn't let my own insecurities or society's expectations take that away from me. I had spent so many years living according to other people's rules, doing what was expected, following the path that made the most sense. But now, with Adam, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in years. It was as if the weight of the years I had lived was being lifted off my shoulders, replaced by something lighter, something more vibrant. In the quiet of my kitchen one morning, as I prepared coffee, I realized something. Age was nothing more than a number. Love, true love, wasn't about the years between us. It wasn't about the milestones I had already passed or the ones Adam had yet to reach. It was about connection, about a bond that had nothing to do with time, and everything to do with how we made each other feel. Alive, wanted, understood. It wasn't just about passion or attraction, though those things were certainly there. It was about something deeper: trust, comfort, the ability to be vulnerable. And Adam had shown me that in ways I hadn't anticipated. His openness, his willingness to step into this unknown space with me, made me believe in what we had. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel like the world had moved on without me. With him, I felt like I mattered, like my life had meaning beyond the roles I had played as a mother, a wife, a daughter. But as much as I wanted to savor this, I knew there were hurdles ahead. The world wasn't always kind to relationships that didn't fit the conventional mold, and I wasn't naive enough to believe that everyone would understand, let alone support, what was happening between Adam and me. But that didn't matter. Not anymore. I had learned enough in my life to know that love could be fleeting, but it could also be transformative. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to embrace it, whatever form it took, whatever obstacles came my way. Love, I realized, was meant to be lived, not to be looked back on or relegated to a chapter that had already ended. And this chapter? It was just beginning. The days after that quiet moment of reflection were a turning point for me. Adam and I continued to see each other, but now, every encounter felt less like a leap into the unknown and more like the beginning of something that could actually last. The uncertainty I once carried had slowly melted away, replaced with the comfort of knowing that what we shared was real, and it was ours. As time passed, we found a rhythm together. Those little moments of quiet companionship, the laughter over shared meals, the soft touches that spoke louder than words ever could. We weren't trying to change the world or prove anything to anyone. We were simply two people who had found each other and decided to see where it led. I won't pretend that everything was always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of our age difference seemed overwhelming. And yes, there were whispers, some from friends, others from strangers, who couldn't fathom why we were together, who made assumptions about what we were doing or why. But with Adam, I felt stronger than I ever had in my life. He made me feel beautiful. He made me feel seen. And in return, I gave him something I hadn't realized I could offer. A wisdom born of years lived fully, the kind of wisdom that doesn't rush, that doesn't fear the future, but simply lives in the moment. There are always risks when you go against the grain, but I had lived too long listening to other people's expectations and fears. For once, I was living for myself, making choices that made me happy, not bound by what was supposed to be. As I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something that filled me with peace. Love at any age is worth pursuing. It's worth fighting for. The rules are only as rigid as we allow them to be, and there is no age limit to the beauty of finding someone who makes your heart race, someone who sees you for who you truly are. What Adam and I had was not perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. Love wasn't just for the young, and it wasn't just for the old. It was for anyone willing to be open, to take a chance on something that could change everything. So I've learned to embrace this new chapter of my life, the one where love doesn't have an expiration date, where age is no barrier, and where every moment feels like a gift. Because in the end, it's not the years you've lived that matter. It's the life you've shared, the love you've given, and the joy that still fills your heart. And for the first time in years, I was no longer afraid to let my heart lead the way.